Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Free Thinkers Anonymous. This is Mike with my co host Jeremy. Thanks for tuning in as we continue our journey discussing the VFX industry. And today we're going to be talking about the Big Six.
Next big topic is going to be the big six, is the structure of the primary studios, the production studios that have been in the film industry since the beginning, or effectively the beginning. At the beginning, back in the early, basically back when Los Angeles first became a filmmaking area, when Hollywood first was developing. You had MGM, Paramount, Fox, Warner Brothers, and RKO. And then you had the small three, which is Universal, United Artists, and Columbia Pictures. And those were the production companies. Like some few small studios would come out with a film or two each year, but those were the ones that were just spitting out movies over and over and over again. If you wanted to make a big film that reached a lot of people, you would go to one of these production studios to pitch your project. Numbers surfaced sometimes under those studios that I already mentioned and then faded away. Touchstone Pictures, TriStar Pictures, and TriStar Pictures was a combination of Columbia Pictures, HBO, and CBS. They came into power. They did a number of really cool movies, and then their movies flopped and they ended up having to shut down shop. In the 90s, the big six, what millennials are most used to as being the production companies, they had the lowest market share of the industry than at any other point in film history. The big six had 64% market share. And this meant that 34 or 36% of the industry was smaller productions. Indie production companies had a chance to make a film that had a major impact on the industry. It also meant that there was a lot more varied competition between those big studios because they had to compete with a whole bunch of smaller companies. And you'll see, let me just kind of go through. So you had the big six, which was now Paramount, MGM United Artists, Fox, Warner Brothers, Columbia, and Universal, which was sold to General Electric, oddly enough, when it became NBC Universal. And then you had the newer little studios. There were 17 powerful studios that were still developing their power, as opposed to the three earlier on. And we'll get to the ones later on, because it's a whole different picture of the way that the film industry is structured. So your newer littles, these are ones that were developed between the late 80s and the early 2000s. You have Columbia, which was sold to Sony and renamed Sony Pictures. You have Orion, you have TriStar, New Line Cinema, Miramax, DreamWorks, Pixar, Relativity Media, Castle Rock Entertainment, Spyglass Media Group, Summit Entertainment, CBS Films, New World Pictures, Turner Pictures, Lucasfilm, Marvel Studios, and Samuel Goldwyn Company. As I'm listing those, I have no doubt that any millennials listening to this can imagine at the beginning of the movie what each of these logos translated as, like TriStar, that unicorn, the New Line Cinema, the film reel. You're looking at Castle Rock Entertainment, which is the lighthouse, the Spyglass Media Group. You have the guy with the spyglass, Summit Entertainment, the mountains. Like it's very nostalgic thinking about all of the intros for those production companies. But since then, all the big players have been bought by one of the five powerhouses of the industry, shutting down most, if not all, competition. They've also gone all out with spectacle, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into individual films and television shows rather than mitigating their losses and gains by making more films that have lower price tags. So there's a few littles left, but not many. So where we were having like dozens to hundreds of films come out every single year, that all of them would hit movie theaters. So every single week we would have a new set of movies to go watch. And the big ones would stick around for longer, but there would always be at least a few new movies that would pour into theaters every single week. Nowadays, it's all limited to the current big five, with few exceptions. And because of that, we're seeing like two or three movies hit theaters a month. I mean, for the big movies, that's about it. We might have one or two little ones thrown in there, but it is extremely rare to see a single week where we have all new movies hitting theaters. Whereas back in the 90s and even into the early 2000s, that was happening regularly. And people keep saying, oh, movie price tickets going up and concessions prices going up. That's why people don't go to theaters anymore. Or it's because there's no big aspect of like you're doing something special. So people don't dress up to go to the movies anymore like they used to back in the mid 20th century. But I think it's just because there's not as much to see. And if you don't like it, then, and if you don't like what these big five production companies are spitting out, then you have no reason to go to the movie theaters because you're not going to see something interesting and new. They spend a lot of money to make sure it is something that the vast majority of people will go see. And that doesn't mean interesting and new. That means tried and true. It's something that you've seen before, modified slightly so that it feels like it's new-ish, but it's basically something that's already been done, the vast majority of it. And that's why we're seeing so many sequels. That's why we're seeing so many reboots. That's why we're seeing so many soft reboots. That's why we're seeing the MCU developing the multiverse and DC developing their multiverse because it's a lot easier to take something that you know did well and say, well, you guys have seen this other thing that you really liked. So this is based off of that. So you should go see it. And that's why people see it initially. It's the star power of that IP title, which makes people go see these films and then they go see these films. And so they just get more and more and more of residual IP as opposed to new IP, intellectual property, where you get interesting new films. It hardly ever happens. And it's because the big five own everything. Let me go through. NBC, Universal, and Comcast. They own Universal, Focus Features, Big Idea Entertainment, DreamWorks, Illumination, and Amblin. So anything that happens at any of those smaller studios is done by NBC Universal. Paramount Pictures Corporation. They own Paramount, 49% of Miramax, BET Films, MTV Entertainment Studios, Nickelodeon Movies, CBS Animation Productions, and Avatar Studios. So anything that's done by any of those smaller studios, done by Paramount Pictures Corp. Then you have Warner Brothers, which, my goodness, Warner Brothers Pictures, New Line Cinema, HBO Films, Spyglass Media Group, they have a minority stake in that. Rooster Teeth Studios, until Rooster Teeth very recently shut down, was an animation studio. Discovery Films, True TV Films, CNN Films, DC Studios, Cartoon Network Movies, Warner Brothers Animation, Alloy Entertainment, Cinemax Films, Flagship Entertainment Group, they have a 49% share, Castle Rock Entertainment, and Turner Entertainment Company. Any of those production companies do, headed by Warner Brothers. And then you have the mouse. Walt Disney Studios owns Walt Disney Pictures, 20th Century Pictures, previously 20th Century Fox, A&E, Indie Films, they have a 50% share in that. Hulu, Documentary Films, Searchlight Pictures, ESPN Films, they have an 80% share. National Geographic Documentary Films, 73% share. Lucasfilm, Marvel Studios, Freeform Original Productions, Walt Disney Animation Studios, Pixar Animation Studios, 20th Century Animation, Lucasfilm Animation, Marvel Animation, 20th Century Family. I think that any of those does has to go through Walt Disney Studios. And then the last of the big five, you have Sony, which is Columbia Pictures, TriStar Pictures, Sony Pictures Classics, Affirm Films, Ghost Corps, Screen Gems, Stage Six Films, Crunchyroll, Sony Pictures Animation, Sony Pictures Imageworks, Destination Films, and Left Bank Pictures. And for all of these major studios, I've actually not included some of the ones that are more internationally related or are notably smaller production companies. But suffice it to say, these big five own the film industry. There is very little competition outside of these big five. Now, there's some, uh, arguably five. There's Lionsgate, which has Lionsgate Films, Summit Entertainment, and 3 Arts Cinema. There's Amazon MGM, which is MGM, Lightworkers Media, and Orion Pictures. There's A24. There's STX, and there's Amblin Partners, which is Amblin Entertainment and DreamWorks Pictures, not DreamWorks Animation. Even though they still stay on the Universal lot, DreamWorks Pictures is separate from DreamWorks Animation and Universal. So you only have five littles and you have five bigs, and that's it. Like everything is under one of those 10 umbrellas. So STX and A24 are the only ones that don't have child companies under them that are broken down into multiple other production companies. So just understand when people talk about the film industry and why it feels like it's all the same, because it is. It's because you're seeing one of five production companies 95% of the time. The other 5% of the time, you're seeing one of five other production companies. And that's it. And I mean, like, that is it. When you see a film that looks like it's an independent film, it's probably A24. When you see a film that looks a little bit familiar but might not be, like, you'll find that it is one of those bigger production companies that is just using their independent film division to produce that film. So not only is the IP getting recycled, but it's all getting recycled by the same people over and over. So, what this means for visual effects workers, because that's what this episode was supposed to be about. When there were a whole bunch of clients that we could choose from, we didn't have to beg, scrape, and steal to get work. We didn't have to undercut constantly to get work. And the sad thing is that VFX exploded in the late 2000s, early 2010s, which is around the time that these consolidation practices were happening. So VFX work very quickly took a nosedive when it came to profitability because you had to compete with other VFX studios for a limited amount of work. And that limited amount of work keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the number of clients you can choose from keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you get blackballed by one of the big production companies, because say they threw you a curveball, did 20 minutes of reshoots, and expected you to do all that work for free, and you said, no, you got to pay for it. They'll say, okay, well, we're never giving you work again then. You got a choice. Are you going to do that work for free, potentially go out of business, or are you going to get blackballed by that studio? If you get blackballed by that studio, your entire industry just shrunk by 20%. That's a huge amount of market share to lose. So it's a difficult choice when the big studios are throwing around their weight, whether or not you're going to go along with it. This is why Rhythm and Hughes shut down. Rhythm and Hughes was the visual effects studio behind the movie Life of Pi. They also did a whole bunch of other movies, but this is kind of their claim to fame because it's what also closed down the studio. They were literally winning the award for best VFX for that year while they had just been bankrupt. All the artists that had done the work on Life of Pi were standing outside of the Oscars with picket signs while they were winning the award for best VFX that year. So when you don't say no to these big production companies, it has drastic repercussions. And you might not be able to work in the industry anymore. If you say yes to these, well, and that's if you say yes. If you say no, you also might not get enough work going forward, which is one of the things that happened to Digital Domain, along with a number of other things. But they were one of the big players in the VFX industry, and they kind of set limits on the bigger production companies to the point where they didn't have enough work coming in, particularly with how they were trying to grow. And they just had to close up shop. They were done. So VFX workers are having to jump from one studio to the next. Like having a consistent job that lasts more than about a year or two is extremely, extremely rare because the whole companies keep shutting down over and over again. And then another one will take its place, charging the production companies significantly less, even more narrow profit margins than they already had. And then they go out of business. And That's for the medium-sized, small-sized VFX studios. For the bigger VFX studios, they control almost everything. Like they have such a partnership with these bigger companies that they might as well just share the same server. Some of them actually do. Server meaning like where all their footage is stored in digital format and how their artists work on those stored servers that store digital information. So it's difficult to find work. And when you can find work, probably going to have to undercut what you were hoping for as far as rates go. Then we're going to jump to streaming services because streaming services also have a huge impact on the industry, particularly like things that have been affecting the industry for a while. So we're still under that umbrella. The big five in streaming are Universal, Paramount, WB, Disney, and Sony. Same five for the big five. So Universal is Peacock and Vudu, 70% of Vudu. Paramount is Paramount Plus, Pluto TV, BET, Noggin, and Nick Plus. WB is Max, previously HBO Max, Discovery Plus, and the other 30% of Vudu. Disney is Disney Plus, Hulu, ESPN Plus. They've got an 80% share in that, and Movies Anywhere. And then Sony, which is Sony Pictures Core, Crunchyroll, and Funimation. So the vast majority of streamers are going to be under those. There are three others that still have some market share. There's Lionsgate, which has Stars, Movieplex, and Lionsgate Plus. Amazon MGM Studios, which has Amazon Prime Video, MGM Plus, Amazon Freevee, and ScreenPix. And then there's Apple, which has Apple Plus. So just the big production studios effectively being the big five and the five littles. You've got the big five for streaming and the three littles. So once again, everything is very isolated to the top tier of power. Power is consolidated, which translates to things being rough for the little guy, just like it always does. Tales all the time. So release schedules for streaming services are all over the place, which has its good and bad elements to it. Release schedules used to be in the fall or in the spring for television, used to be in the winter and summer for film. So it made it a little bit predictable for these VFX studios to be able to anticipate when they were going to get work and when they weren't. That's much less the case because there's no release season for streamers. You might find it's a little bit more common in certain times, but that's constantly shifting. They really haven't developed when they're going to be sending out a bunch of content all at once. It's usually just a constant stream of content, which has its pluses and minuses. It means that for workers, we don't work an insane amount of hours and then get fired as likely anymore when it comes to VFX studios that work for streaming services. However, there still is plenty of that because the film industry still does have its seasons. And now a bunch of films that were released in theaters are also being released on streaming services, which has, I would say, generally more negative impact than positive. But the release schedules being all over the place, it's got its good and bads. They also don't typically give new IP, new intellectual property, a chance to grow before cutting it, for the most part. There's Shadow and Bone is a good example of a series that was starting to grow and they were just like, nope, not making enough money quickly enough, we're done. There's countless examples of that though. Netflix shows, Hulu shows, Disney Plus shows, or HBO Max shows, Apple Plus shows, Amazon shows. Like they give them a season, maybe two, and then cut. It almost doesn't matter how good it is because they don't give it enough time for it to spread through word of mouth. I mean, you look at viewership numbers for Game of Thrones in season one and two, and they weren't that good. And then you look at the viewership numbers for Game of Thrones by season eight, it was it something like 3% of the entire country had seen Game of Thrones season eight. Like, that's crazy. That's crazy that you get that amount of people to watch an individual show that particularly is meant for an older audience. That's why films generally like to be rated PG-13 as opposed to R because they want a wider demographic that they can appeal to. Game of Thrones is very clearly rated R or above. So it's amazing that they had the market share that they did because HBO actually allowed them the chance to grow. But most streaming services don't allow their IP a chance to grow. They give them just enough time to see whether or not they're going to do good, kind of, and then they cut them. The big changes in streaming services lately is that they used to be a massive money dump, but now budgets are tightening very quickly and by a massive amount. Because back when streaming services first kind of set up, they were set up in a way that they didn't have to pay residuals to writers, to actors, to directors nearly as much as they did for films and television. Like they were pocketing an insane amount of money just by not having to pay residuals or the equivalent to the residuals that they would have had to pay. Residuals basically meaning that every time that a movie was seen in theaters, they would have to pay the people that worked on it a certain amount of money because they were making money on it. Same with when television or movies are broadcast on broadcast or cable television, they would have to pay all the people that worked on it, even down to background actors. If their name appeared in the credits, they would get at least, and sometimes even if their name didn't appear in the credits, they would still get a small amount of money according to the size of the audience that watched it and or just the actual broadcast channels. Certain broadcast channels would pay a certain amount for each time that they aired a certain television show or movie because they would get ad revenue that would then pay for the ability to broadcast that television show or movie. With streaming services, people are paying to watch the streaming services. And the only way to bring people in to the streaming services is to have content. So initially, it was we need all the content. We're not going to charge people an insane amount of money. Once people bought into streaming services as the primary way that they actually consume television and movies, then they were like, all right, now let's flip the script and we're going to add in ads so we get ad revenue and we're going to increase the cost of the streaming services so we get that revenue too. And we saved a lot of money because we're not paying anyone residuals on top of that. So they're making an insane amount of money beyond what they were making before. But this is just the CEOs and top level executives and shareholders that are making this money. It's not the people that are actually working on this stuff that are making the money. They're making less than they used to. So Amazon went from spending 1.2 billion in 2013 to 18.9 billion in 2023 with consistent increases that entire time. Biggest growth was spurred by Jennifer Salk because she realized how much money Amazon had and she said, okay, we are going to use Amazon money. Like, we're going to throw an insane amount of money at these projects. She was very vocally, staunchly in support of minorities, of female led projects. And it seems like, for the most part, she wasn't looking at the quality of the project itself. She was just looking at the demographics of the people that made the project and what kind of message the project was supporting. And if it was supporting the right message and had the right demographic of people working on it, she would throw money at it. And that resulted in a series flop, mediocre ratings over and over and over again. We have Rings of Power, Citadel, Wheel of Time, Daisy Jones and the Six, The Power, Dead Ringers, Peripheral. Those are all things that did significantly poorer than they anticipated, and it was an insane amount of money that was being thrown at these projects. So Andy Jassy, the CEO of Amazon Prime Video, cut 37 projects and is cutting hundreds of jobs in Amazon Prime Video's production force. So where there was a lot of projects and a lot of VFX work, now there's almost none. Then you look at Netflix, they were spending a comparable amount and they unintentionally cut spending by about 300 million in 2023, kind of because of leftover issues from the pandemic. Oh, sorry, intentionally cut spending by 300 million in 2023 because of the strikes. They cut another $1 billion. That's $1.3 billion that they cut in 2023 from spending in 2022. They do plan on increasing the spending amount in 2024, but it's still going to be plateauing around 17 billion, which is still another 1.9 billion less than Amazon. And Netflix typically comes out with significantly more work, which means they're putting less money into more projects, which means these are generally projects that are going to rely much more heavily on practical effects, which means less work for VFX workers. Disney faced a net loss of $1 billion in Q1 of 2023. And to make up for that, they cut $5 billion in expenses for the remainder of the year. So they cut the equivalent to approximately 25% of their costs for 2023. So because of that, we saw a lot less Disney films coming out. Elemental was one of the few big animated films of 2023 that came out of Disney, and it did horribly. The other Disney movies that came out in 2023 also did pretty poorly, with rare exceptions. Like Wish, for instance, I think very, very few people even remember Wish being a thing. They tried to market it, but it didn't have any kind of appeal, and the movie itself didn't have any hint of love behind it. There was no depth to it. There was nothing that Disney movies typically had before then, like Coco and Moana. It's a mess with how much these big streaming companies and big production companies have completely ruined their space in the film industry as a whole, particularly when they are the only competitors. And instead of understanding that they need to grow the industry as a whole, they're saying, what can we get out of the market share? And all of them are just failing miserably, shrinking the size of the market. People are watching less movies. They're cutting out their streaming services because the costs keep going up and ads keep getting thrown in. And people are just, they've had enough. They're like, we're done. We're not going to keep giving you our money if you're not going to give us something that's actually entertaining that we want to watch. So that basically tackles all of the things that have been affecting the VFX industry for a while. The streaming services, the conglomeration of power at the top for production companies, outsourcing, these are all things that we've been dealing with for a long time. And that creates a climate in the VFX industry where things are rough. Things aren't horrible. There's kind of a light at the end of the tunnel with these things. However, they're still really rough. We're talking the situation that I talked about in episode one, where workers are working 60 to 80-hour weeks regularly without any breaks, where that can go for months on end, where the pay for that is just enough to be able to survive on and eat out because you don't have time to actually make food. All of the jobs are in high cost of living areas. So VFX workers are living in kind of a rough spot, and VFX studios keep going out of business. And the bigger VFX studios keep getting bought out by bigger VFX studios and or production companies. Deluxe is a good example of that. Deluxe is one of the two colorization companies, one of the first quote unquote post production companies. They would offer DI services or digital intermediate. So if you ever watch movies, once movies first became color, you'll either see Technicolor or Deluxe listed at the end of the movie in the credits, sometimes even at the beginning of the movie. They were the two colorization companies. Primary thing that they did, they would take black and white film, they would turn it into color. Over time, they transitioned into digital intermediate services where they would take real film projects and they would convert that into digital film projects where then digital visual effects would be added to it, because it's a lot easier to do visual effects on digital footage than it is on true film. Because true film, do visual effects on it, you literally have to paint individual frames, and keeping that consistent and making it look good is effectively impossible. There's ways to do it in camera, but to not do it in camera, things get very iffy very quickly. So Deluxe is a company that's been around since the 50s. They kind of followed the trends as far as the digital space goes, but they focus so much on the transition from film to digital that when people stopped shooting in film, they didn't really have much going on. They were like, hey, maybe we could set up a VFX studio. And they realized very quickly that that was outside of the scope of their expertise and they had no idea what they were doing. So they just started buying up all the VFX studios. So now Method, Encore, Stereo D, and Deluxe, and I believe there's two or three more at this point that are all owned by Deluxe, which used to be individual medium-sized VFX studios. They are all now much bigger VFX studios that are all under the same umbrella of Deluxe. So that conglomeration of power at the top has just been a continuous thing, even within the film industry. Whenever medium-sized VFX studios haven't gone under, they get bought out. So that's what's been going on.
Yeah, I think the big six, the big five, and the small three, that was great. I don't know how I missed that in film school. They didn't cover that,
Mhm.
but that was a great breakdown to just give people an idea of how small, first of all, that's what they always say in Hollywood. It's a small business. Be careful who you make enemies with. So if you ever see a big star that all of a sudden they fall off, they piss somebody off. Or they realize that this wasn't for them and they got out. One of those two happened. But yeah, Hollywood is that's the kind of business it is. It's very much who you know and who you got to be buddy buddy with. It's a very small industry and pretty much yeah, unfortunately, like you mentioned, that they try to not the word's not capitalize. The word is monopolize, not really, but any kind of competition, anything that can disrupt what they got going on, they try to buy out or try to squash, as many big companies do. Hollywood's a business, so it operates just like any other big business in America. They want to make sure that they're always in control, that they remain the top dogs. And unless the other competition kind of plays ball and understands their place, like cable companies. I think here in California, that was always a thing that people argue about is they kind of divide up the territories where every cable company is pretty much the only one you can really get for a specific area. And very few of them overlap. And they make sure that their prices are similar because, that's a way that multiple people can stay in business, but they all thrive and are successful. But right now, tough for them, right? They're kind of cannibalizing each other with, the main reason that these studios switched to streaming, they made that pivots because disc sales are going down. People don't really buy physical media anymore. CDs, DVDs, now Blu-rays. That's not really
Yeah.
what people are interested in. A lot of people love the idea of it's on my phone, it's on my laptop, wherever I go, it's with me. And people take that for granted. I think that's another segment we'll do one day of what do you really own? I think that's a big thing because what gets lost in the cracks is rights, property rights, streaming rights, proprietary rights. If those things change hands and shift, music and movies that you think you own digitally, all of a sudden they're gone from your library. And that's because someone else now owns the rights and or it's on the negotiating table. So until that's resolved, no one can access this content. And you might have to repurchase stuff. I know I was helping my mom out with that the other day. She had a best of collection of, I don't remember if it was Marvin Gaye or Barry White, one of those that she grew up with, loving their music from like, I think 70s, 80s. And yeah, that library just went away. And she's like, what happened? I'm like, oh, it was a best of collection. Yeah, that was probably put out by one distributor. They no longer can distribute that. So you lost it. And she had to buy a brand new collection, even though she had it for like the last like 5 years. So all of a sudden she had to go out and buy a new digital CD. I mean, digital album. And that's how this stuff works. So yeah, so that's why these studios went into the streaming wars. That's what's currently going on. It's because they lost out on money, which that's another revenue of money, how much you can resell the same thing. So when a movie comes out in theaters, that's one purchase. When it's out for rental or to own or to buy, that's another purchase. And every time you see a movie seen on another channel, that's another distribution fee that platform had to pay that studio to put it on their service. So they're always reselling the same thing to keep making money off the same thing.
We're not making money off it. It's just them that are.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's just how the studio can keep making more money on the same piece of property. So that's what they do. And since Blu-rays were going down the toilet, they said, "Hey, Netflix claims that they're making billions per year on the streaming service." So everyone jumped in thinking, "Oh, billions? We hear billions. We want to make billions too." But Netflix only told half the story. Oh, we make billions per year, but how much do you spend per year? How much
Yeah, they're talking about revenue. They're not talking about gross.
exactly? So they don't ever talked about how much profit they made year to year. And then when everyone got into it, Netflix was like, whoops, my bad. I guess I should have said something. We don't really make money here. You know,
Yeah.
we just operate to stay afloat. That's it. And now, just in case you're wondering, what streaming service should I buy? Should I buy this one, that one? What should I reinvest in? Guess what, everybody? Everyone got into the streaming battle to go to war with Netflix. Everything's coming to Netflix. So, in case you want to know, we're not really sponsored or advertising that you should have a Netflix account. But if you just need one, you can just stick with Netflix. Everything's going to be just redistributed and coming back to Netflix because Netflix is just a streaming platform. They exist just to put out streaming content. That's why they're going to be able to sustain it because that's their entire business model. Everyone
Mhm.
else is their studio that they're putting out movies. If you're Disney Universal, you got theme parks. So there's other things that they need to keep afloat and make money, make sure that other things, if it's making less this year, hey, we're making money more in this other area this year. That way they can stay afloat. These are businesses, as much as they want to appear as if they're making a ton of money, they may be worth a lot once they had to liquidate and sell everything off. But a lot of these businesses are kind of scraping by in a sense. I mean, the people at the very top, they get their bonuses, they get their checks, they're making tons of money. But if you follow and pay attention, everyone's making cutbacks. There's always a ton of layoffs. They're always reducing the bottom line in some way. Like Jeremy was mentioning, all these streaming services are spending way too much money. So they're all looking at spending less money to be more cost effective so that they're not losing. Because so far, outside of Netflix, everyone's losing
Mhm.
money. So
Mhm.
they're all realizing that this isn't really a way to make profit. This is just another way to just release content. That's all it is. It's just, oh, you missed it in theaters, now you can watch it on streaming. That's what it really is. So we're going to expect to see less and less original content on every streaming service outside of Netflix. That's just a reality. There was a huge boom, and then we'll get more, and we'll pack all that more, how the pandemic and lockdowns affected everything. But it was just a false bubble that was created during the pandemic where everyone's at home. So what are they going to do? They can't go watch stuff in theaters. They're going to watch stuff on streaming services. So that's why a lot of services blew up, were hella successful. They all thought that's the future. It's not. That was a temporary situation. And now everyone's going back to going outside, living their lives. Guess what? People are unsubscribing. Viewership and just subscriptions overall for streaming services have dropped a lot. So in the case of Jeremy and I, there was a flood of opportunity because everyone was making a ton of shows, a ton of content, and now that's shrinking. So we'll unpack that more in the next segment when we come back to how the pandemic affected our industry.
I think on top of people getting rid of their streaming service accounts, I'd say that's probably at least a three-pronged issue. Number one, they are going out and living their lives more, but also number two, there's a guaranteed recession coming. All the big players, all the billionaires are selling stock from their companies so that they can have an insane amount of wealth just on hand when they need it. And that doesn't happen unless they see the writing on the wall. Also, I mean, I've been talking about a recession coming within the next few years soon anyway, and I think everybody's starting to feel it. So with everybody starting to feel it and realizing the whole point of streaming services was, oh, instead of spending $80 a month for cable, now we get to spend $10 a month or $20 a month on a few streaming services. But now all the streaming services, and so that's now there's so many streaming services that they're spending even more than they would have on cable. So it translates to like just not being the savings going this direction at all. Anyway, so people aren't saving money, people have less money. So that's one problem. Pandemic's over. That's the other problem. Third prong is streaming services are starting to suck like really hard. As I mentioned, they're cutting back, they're ending projects, they don't allow a lot of their IP room to breathe, so they're not well developed enough, they're not actually getting anywhere, and then they just cut out and people are like, well, why am I going to get invested in anything that a streaming service does if they're just going to kill it before it gets anywhere. So people have stopped watching streaming service content anyway. And on top of that, people like streaming services are costing more and more over time. And like Amazon, you have to pay more for their commercial version than you used to fairly recently. And then they're going to up it even more if you want to get rid of those commercials. Like
Mm,
the whole point of paying for a streaming service is to not have to deal with commercials, to not be marketed to constantly. And Hulu does this too. They're both like, hey, we're going to throw commercials at you, even though you paid to not have commercials, because we can. And you just are going to have to keep paying more and more money to avoid being marketed to constantly
mm,
and avoid wasting your day when you're just trying to enjoy something so that we can try to sell you something. So it doesn't make any sense for people, even if they weren't in dire financial straits, which they generally are nowadays. But even if they weren't, the quality of the product is going down. There's more ads being tossed in, and the price is going up. Like, there's no reason to stick with a business like that. If they're going to basically screw over their clients over and over and over again with no apologies whatsoever because they just feel like it. And they're not coming out with new content. They're not coming out with good content. And their gestion systems aren't any better than they used to be. They're not bringing in a good amount of 1990s, 1980s, early 2000s content, which is what most people are looking for when they're going to Netflix or even Hulu or Amazon Prime. At least Disney has a wide array of animated content to go for, and they have a fair amount of live action content to go for. But for all the other streaming services, like that retro vibe is non-existent. You're either looking at stuff that like nobody wanted to watch 20 years ago, and that's about it.
guess we'll just end things here, and that wraps up another episode of Free Thinks Anonymous. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and catch us for the next one.